Jacobs Point, like all tidal marshes, contains three distinct zones: low marsh, high marsh, and an upland area at its farthest inland edge. Every day, the low marsh is covered in salt water twice and also uncovered twice. The high marsh slips beneath the salt only in storms, which is to say, along the point's seaward edge, plants and animals have adapted to live with the tides, while upland, the opposite is true. Think of a tidal marsh as, like all wetlands, a transitional region where distinctions blur and the entire wet world morphs into the almost entirely dry one. It is a liminal ribbon, an in-between, a spit of land at the edge of things where the governing laws change 4 times a day. So that's from the book. And again, that is all you need to know from the book today. We're going to talk now about marshes. We learn how marshes migrate, how sea levels eroding them, why their restoration and preservation may be key to resilience against rising seas, as one about the best ways to store more carbon and buffer shorelines against flooding, storms, and generally, again, rising seas. So we're going to talk about them with some expert guests, and those guests are here with me today. They are Letitia Grenier, a senior scientist at the Resilient Landscapes program at the San Francisco Estuary Institute. Hey there, Letitia. Well, Letitia is unmuting herself. Oh, there she is. We also have Marcelo Ardon, an associate professor at the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. Hey there, Marcelo.
Hello.
So we're going to start with those tidal marshes that I just read the excerpt about. And Letitia, that's sort of your area of expertise. I read that excerpt from the book. What would you add to the description? What are the ingredients and kind of terms that we need to know?
Tidal marshes are the most important ecosystem you've never heard of. Often we drive by them if you live near the coast, and so many of us do, and you don't even think about them. They're pretty flat. They're often greenish or grayish in the fall when the plants are getting older. And what's really important about them is they do so many things for people and also for nature and wildlife. And so for that reason, and I'll list some of the things they do for us, they are consistently ranked as the most valuable ecosystem in the world for people, or maybe the second most. Sometimes coral reefs kind of edge them out. But these types of coastal wetlands are really important. They lie between high tide and low tide. So they actually are tidal. The tide goes in and out of them every day. And it comes via this network of channels that's a lot like the arteries bringing blood into your body and muscles and then taking it away. So they're really vital in that way. They're very connected to the ocean and to the land. They're really half of each. And what they do for us are things like sequester and store carbon. So they're actually helping mitigate climate change, but they also protect the shoreline. So they're helping us adapt to climate change by absorbing water, reducing erosion. If you have a big tidal marsh in front of your shoreline, you can actually have a much smaller levee behind it than you would need to have if you didn't have that marsh there. They also have lots of important species in them, endangered species, especially in California, and they make food. That's a huge thing. They make tons and tons of food, which feeds fish and other kinds of sea life, and that feeds people and even more wildlife. So they're kind of, I think of them as the refrigerators of California where we work.
Thank you, Letitia. And Marcelo, meanwhile, in North Carolina, you're working in a very different kind of coastal wetland. It's actually a freshwater ecosystem. And you have a picture of kind of what's going on there behind you, but tell us about sort of your area of study.
Yeah, so I love that that description that you just read from the book, talking about the low marsh, the high marsh, and the upland, because that's what we've been studying. We've been looking we started studying upland forested wetlands. And here, when we say upland, they just mean they're a little higher elevation. And so we don't have the influences of those tides that you have in the marshes. But what we've been seeing is that that line that separates the forest and the marsh has been shifting. We've been getting, sea levels are rising, the soils, these wetlands are getting saltier, and then we're having more storms as well. And so we're having these forested wetlands are turning into marshes in some cases, and in some other cases, which is happening in this photo behind me, we don't really have that marsh state. Basically, these forested wetlands get swallowed by in our case, in the sounds, the estuaries, the Albemarle Sound or the Pamlico Sound. So we have a loss of all of these ecosystem services. Like Letitia so beautifully explained, Marshes provide a lot of ecosystem services. Forested wetlands provide a lot of those ecosystem services as well. So if forest wetland turns into a marsh, maybe that's not as big of a deal. But when you have a forested wetland turn into open water, then you're definitely losing a lot of those ecosystem services.
Well, and you're already referring to something that Elizabeth talks about in this book, which is the migration and transitions of marshes and wetlands to different kinds of marshes and wetlands and ecosystems. And I wonder if you could talk more about that process, both how a marsh can change under rising seas, but also how in some ways that change isn't always bad, perhaps. And maybe Marcelo, you want to start, and Letitia follow up.
Yeah, so maybe I'll talk about the marsh to forest transition, and Letitia can talk more about the marshes and how they're very good at moving up and down. And I guess one way that I like to think about it is these marshes and these wetlands and the sea level are kind of dancing, right? They're kind of doing this back and forth. If you look over a long enough period of time, we know that sea levels have been higher in the past than they are now. They have retreated, and now they're kind of moving back up again. And so you could imagine these marshes and these wetlands dancing and going back and forth as these changes have been happening. So these changes are not new. What I think it's important to remember is that the rate of change now is faster. So we know that the sea levels are rising at rates that are faster than at least the last 2,000 years. And so when you have these changes happening at a faster rate, it means that these wetlands don't have the time to migrate as they've migrated in the past. So that's one problem, the change is faster. And the other problem is that we've put barriers that prevent this movement as well. We've built roads, we've put agricultural fields, we've put golf courses, marinas, all these different things. So change is happening faster, and we're preventing or restricting the ability of these ecosystems to change or to adapt to this, which kind of gives it a double whammy, and we end up with things that look like this. We have these dead trees standing in the water, in case you can't see the picture behind me.
Yeah, thank you for actually, because we will have radio listeners later on who won't be able to see this picture. So thank you for that, Marcelo. Yeah, Letitia, and I know we don't always talk about sea level rise on the West Coast the way we do on the East Coast. So what's going on in the San Francisco Bay estuary? What's going on with the transitions that those marshes are undergoing? How is climate change shaping the ecosystems that you're working in?
Yeah, thanks for that question. On the West Coast, we've seen about a foot of sea level rise over the past 100 years. Our marshes are doing fantastic right now. They are very happy. They are keeping up with sea level rise. And this is kind of part of the problem. We're a very reactionary species, human beings, and we need to be proactive, because we know that rate of sea level rise is going to go up and up and up. And if you wait till the last minute to do something about it, it's going to be way too hard to put into place the management that you need to, so that the marshes can keep up. So what's amazing about tidal marshes, in addition to all the things I said before, is that they're super resilient. So if they have enough material, remember those arteries I was talking about where the tide comes in and goes out of the marsh, that will actually bring in sediment. So dirt in water is sediment. So it will bring in that mud. And as the tide gets to the high tide and then it turns around, it has to stop. If you think about it, the tide comes all the way up to high tide, it stops and then turns around and goes out. And in that moment of stopping, the water velocity is 0 and the sediment falls out of the water and lands on the marsh. And so if there is enough sediment in your water, your marsh can build itself up quite rapidly with sea level rise. The challenge is, where are you going to get that sediment? And actually a piece of that is the marsh plants can actually make their own sediment, which is very cool. But in our estuary and along most of California coast, and really most of the coast of the world, we do need that inorganic sediment, that mud, to build up the marshes. And the issue is that we've interrupted a lot of how sediment flows through our ecosystems with our dams and our other water projects that have changed how sediment moves. And so we don't have enough. So we've actually done the research here in San Francisco Bay to figure that out. And we only have 40% of what we need for our marshes to last until 2100. Now that means we can take really active management measures to figure out where to get that sediment. We have options. And as Marcelo was talking about, the marshes could move inland. We wouldn't even need to do anything. The marshes would move themselves inland, except that we've created barriers so they can't do that. But there are many things we can do to create enough material for the marshes to build up, but it takes really decades with all of our environmental regulations and landscape modification to get the sediment in the right place to be able to do that. So that's why we have to plan ahead.
I have a question, an audience question, actually, our first one, Steve from Sacramento. It's a question about the Delta there, which Letitia, I know you are familiar with. Steve, if you want to go ahead and ask that question.
Yes, I was wondering how much has saltwater penetrated into the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and what has been the impact on the ecosystem, if any?
Yeah, Letitia, maybe you can describe that delta a little bit for people who aren't familiar with the region.
Of course. We have a really interesting inland delta that is also tidal. It's very confusing. So the San Francisco, it's called, actually the full estuary is called the San Francisco Bay Delta Estuary. And an estuary is where a river meets the sea, and you get this mixing of waters. So you get the sort of the salt water, the fresh water, and the in-between brackish water. And you also get the tides having an influence. And our estuary goes 100 miles inland, all the way from San Francisco to Sacramento. So it's very big. The upper half of the estuary is all freshwater. So it's just the tide pushing freshwater back and forth and having those tides 2 times daily. It's a really unique ecosystem. It was huge. It was 500,000 acres of tidal marsh, freshwater tidal marsh historically. The only other really big one like that that's at all comparable is behind me in this picture, which is the Okavango Delta, which isn't really comparable. It's also a super unique but different ecosystem. And that ecosystem of the California Delta has been converted almost entirely to agriculture. So we've lost 98% of our tidal marshes in that area. So it's a really, really different place now. And we do have many endangered species as well as many competing uses of the landscape and the water. There has been saltwater intrusion, and it's mostly related to the incredible amount of water that is pumped out of our rivers to go for people to use for agriculture and for cities. And that actually causes the rivers to run backwards sometimes, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. And so in a year where there's not a lot of flow coming from the rivers, so in California, we have lots of droughts, we have dry years, we have wet years, that's pretty normal. It's just getting more extreme with climate change. That means that sometimes when the pumps are really running, it'll suck the salt water in farther up the estuary. And that's a huge problem. We can't have people drinking salt water, of course. So there's really in-depth management procedures where they build barriers to keep the salt water out of the critical area where the pumps are going to Southern California. So far, ecologically, that saltwater intrusion piece has been more an issue for human water consumption. But if we think about where the freshwater line would be if we weren't taking all that water out of the rivers, that loss of freshwater into the estuary has been a huge issue that relates to the decline of a lot of our native freshwater and brackish water species and the many endangered species we have. So it's kind of a 2-part question. I think it's pretty well managed for human consumption. It's not, we are seeing a lot of ecological impacts. The only other thing I'd say is in our delta, we have, unfortunately, these levees made out of peat, which turns into jello essentially during an earthquake. And so if we have a big earthquake in the delta, it's going to shake, a lot of the levees are going to fail, and that will pull a lot of salt water in. And that's really our biggest concern in terms of saltwater in the delta in the near future. Is if we have an earthquake, that could be a big disaster for drinking water and agricultural water in California.
Thank you, Letitia. We have another question from John in Forks, Washington, and his question, Marcelo, I think is good for you. It's about ghost forests, actually, but on the West Coast. But the ghost forests, I don't think we unpacked that term, but that's those trees that are dead in the water behind you. That's a ghost forest, essentially. And we can talk about that more in a second. But John, why don't you go ahead and ask that question if you're...
Here in the Northwest and in Alaska, we have ghost forests that formed as the result of subduction zone earthquakes. This is the extreme of rapid, if infrequent, change. Do they provide any insight into the ability of habitats to respond to such changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, so what we mean by ghost forests are these, basically a place where you had a forest and for some reason you've had rapid mortality of the trees there. In some cases, you have the marsh vegetation coming in, and so you can see the dead trees and kind of the spartina or the cordgrass coming in. In some other cases, you just have the water coming in. I've read about these ghost forests in Alaska that have to do because of the earthquake and subduction. Honestly, I don't know that much about them. They seem really interesting. And it might be a good place to study what, as you say, a very rapid change. I think it is, an extreme, so it can give us kind of an endpoint, because the changes that we're seeing, for example, here in North Carolina, but they're seeing similar changes in South Carolina and Georgia, that change happens a little bit slower than what is probably happening in Alaska and other places in the Northwest. But absolutely, that's a great question. And I would love to fly over there to check those out.
So we are going to be writing Marcelo a check for a private plane to go check out those ghost forests. Marcelo, I think this is actually a good time to talk about what you are studying with the ghost forests on your coast. And I know maybe this is a controversial phrase, but tree farts are one of your big samples that you're taking. Tell us more about the importance of sampling gases from these ecosystems and what they can tell us about what's going on.
Yeah, so let me kind of explain the tree farts, right? So wetlands are very good at sequestering carbon, right? And that means that they're very good. They're taking up more carbon from the atmosphere than they're releasing. So marshes are really, really good at this. However, freshwater wetlands can also release methane, and methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. Methane can also, I'm sorry, my phone is talking to me. And anyway, sorry. So methane, you might have heard related to climate change in that, cow farts release a lot of methane. And so we were very interested in seeing these ghost forests where you have these standing dead trees. And we were interested in trying to figure out if these standing dead trees were serving as straws or chimneys, facilitating the release of gases from the soil to the atmosphere, or if they were more like corks in keeping the gases in the soil. So one of my grad students came up with these, she adapted some methods to put chambers along, around these trees and measure the greenhouse gas emissions from these dead trees. Because we were very interested in methane, as kind of a joke, we started calling them tree farts. We were saying that, they were tree farts. In some ways, it's similar to a fart, right? In this case, it's a gas produced by the digestion of microbes in the soils. When we fart, it's gases that are released from the digestion of microbes in our gut. So, whose fart is it anyway? We can argue about that. But anyway, we called it tree farts, and we've been studying these greenhouse gas emissions from the dead trees. What we found is that the trees can function as straws, but they're more like filtered straws, because while methane is being transported up the trees, it's also changing and it's decreasing in concentration. So it's more of a filtered straw. And yeah.
Thank you, Marcelo. And I guess one of the questions that I have for both of you is just, it sounds like as we lose marshes or as marsh quality degrades, we are seeing more release of climate change intensifying gases. It's a loop, basically, where climate change is worsening climate change. I mean, how is this a source of worry that people who are concerned about climate change overall should have, sort of on the same scale as maybe the worry they have about fossil fuels or other big sources of greenhouse gases?
So that's a really good question in terms of the scale. It is definitely a positive feedback loop in that when we lose these marshes, we are releasing carbon, right? As we kill these trees, we are releasing the carbon that used to be stored in these trees. And so one of the things that we've been interested in is as you lose all of that carbon and it gets released, if you have marshes come back in, like we've said, marshes are very good at sequestering carbon. It could be that over time, those marshes are going to sequester as much carbon as was stored in those trees before, right? So it could be that it's not that big of a change. However, it's a problem of time scale. It might take marshes up to 100 years to sequester as much carbon as was stored in those trees that were lost. And so it's something that we don't have those extra 100 years to wait for those marshes to catch up with those forested wetlands that were before. I will say though that these changes tend to be they're of a lower magnitude than we think about, you know, when we talk about our emissions, right? And so this is a problem, but you know, when we're talking about problems and how do we solve this problem, reducing our emissions is by far the most efficient and the best way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanna
Letitia,
add,
oh yeah, go ahead.
we have opportunities to use coastal wetlands to be very positive in terms of greenhouse gas flux. So as we've been talking about, salt marshes are a net positive, you know, and they're good at sequestering carbon, and then they keep it. And I think they keep that carbon stored under the water. And one of the things, unfortunately, we've been realizing with the increase in wildfires is that we can't count on trees and forests to store carbon as long as we used to. And, you know, we don't even know if we're going to have 100 years to grow a big tree anymore before a fire comes through. So I think there's real questions, unfortunately, because forests are another, you know, super important and valuable ecosystem, about forests as a big management tool. So I think wetlands are really important to think about. The other piece is, and I think the example of the flooded forest is a really good one, but in a lot of other places, what are you restoring to a wetland? So in the Delta that we were talking about before, we're restoring farmland to freshwater tidal marsh. Now, freshwater tidal marsh does emit methane, but because it also sequesters and stores carbon, and it's replacing often agricultural practices that are much worse in terms of greenhouse gas flux, it's a net positive in terms of benefits with greenhouse gas flux and carbon storage. So it's pretty complicated, but there are tons of opportunities because we've lost so many wetlands. There's actually a lot of opportunities to put wetlands back in good places and have them be resilient and sustainable in the long term. It is probably going to mean thoughtful, active management to make that happen. One of the way I think about it is, you know, we had these nice ecosystems that worked. They were like a car, all the pieces fit together and the car was running. And then we slowly like took apart the pieces of the car. I did something with dams in the top of my watershed, and you put levees on your wetlands in the bottom of the watershed. And now the car doesn't work together very well together. And if we're going to put it back together for our own benefit, this is really not just about wildlife or nature. This is about humans getting what we need. We need to design the pieces of the car so that the car can run again and do the things that we want it to do.
Letitia, this actually is the perfect lead up to the question I wanted to ask you, which is, as a senior scientist for a resilient landscapes program, how do you define a resilient landscape, especially in the wetland context?
Well, the first question we ask with any project is what needs to be resilient to what? And what the answer is usually is that we want functions that benefit people, like providing fresh water, or sometimes supporting endangered species because we care about that, or making food, or whatever it is, you know, keeping our fish alive. Salmon is a really big deal in most parts of the world, and certainly here in California. And then the to what is usually climate change is what we think of first in our minds. But what we have to realize is the legacy impacts on our landscapes that we're already dealing with. Like I talked about how we lost 98% of the marshes in a 500,000 acre marsh. Like that's a really big loss of a really valuable system. Now we use that land for good things. We've been making food on that land for people for a long time. But you have to think about, okay, so climate change is coming to the Delta. It's not coming to a pristine landscape. It's coming to this highly impacted landscape. So it's really the resilience of our functions of interest, which, as Marcelo said, are often called ecosystem services to people, and to the challenges of the future combined with the challenges we already created for ourselves with what we've done in the past. And I think the answer I gave really, to me, is the right one. We need to put ecosystems back together so they function well. And when they function well, there's a lot of alignment between what people need and what wildlife need or what nature needs. So there really isn't I think we have this historical conflict, like man versus nature. I just always hated that. I was like, that doesn't feel right inside me. You know, really what we need is people as a part of nature and all of us thriving together, including the biodiversity around us, so that all the wonderful places that we live in can continue to be wonderful for ourselves and all the future folks who are coming along.
And I apologize, I'm going to be I'm trying to balance like the West Coast questions with the East Coast questions. So I'm trying to go back and forth a little bit, but there is a question actually about another West Coast question about the oil spill actually in Southern California. And that's from Kay. And Kay, I don't know if you want to ask that yourself. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if so.
All right. Hi, my name is Karina Solsky. And what I wanted to know is that I had read a couple days ago that there was a major oil spill off the coast of California, and what type of impacts, as you have rising sea levels and all that, how is it going to impact differently the marshes? And the second part of the question is, are there land stewardship policies in place right now to protect and restore a marsh? I can understand reforestation projects, but how do you protect a marsh?
Yeah, great question. I happened to be at Disneyland, which is just inland of where the oil spill was when it was happening. And then I felt so guilty afterward, like I was having fun and that horrible thing was happening. So the main impact immediately of oil spills is oiled wildlife, largely seabirds, but also some mammals. It mucks up their fur, and then that fur or feathers is what's actually keeping them warm, and they get cold and they get sick and they die. So that's immediately what's happening is oil spill response, trying to contain the oil, clean it up, and help the wildlife. In the long term, you do have oil getting onto the beaches and all the other habitat types, and it has to be cleaned up. Often in marshes, so hard to clean them up without damaging them. Sometimes you can't, and you just let the oil become part of that sedimentation process where the marsh is building itself up. I don't think climate change is really going to change oil spill impacts. It's going to be a similar process. And for this one right now, I don't think climate change is playing a big role. There may be water quality issues that change as the water gets warmer. Somebody had a question about harmful algal blooms. That is changing quite a bit. So issues of disease and harmful algal blooms and those kind of things will change with climate change as air temperatures and water temperatures increase. That really affects the sort of the chemistry and biology of how that works. You also asked about the policies. I wasn't quite sure if that was only related to oil spills, but there's a lot of activity in California preventing further drilling on the coast for exactly this reason. Despite everybody's best efforts, accidents happen, and the more infrastructure you have out there that's got oil moving around, the more problems you could have. In terms of marsh restoration, it's a pretty, historically it was a pretty easy process. You would go to a place that's at the right elevation and has tide, and you would simply open it up to the tide. Most of these places have been diked for agriculture or to make cities or other things. Salt reclamation was a big thing around San Francisco Bay. And if you open a place that's at that right elevation and the tide comes in, honestly, nature does the rest. It's kind of amazing. The seeds are often there, they get brought by the tide, the sediment builds up, the animals come. We've had wildlife returning to restored marshes in 5 years, endangered species in these marshes very, very quickly. Now, that was the past when sea level wasn't rising so fast. In the future, we're going to have to think about how to bring enough sediment to those marshes to keep them around. I hope that was the gist of your question.
Speaking of restoration, since that was something I wanted to make sure we got to anyway, Marcelo, there's restoration happening on the East Coast too. How is that going? Is that something where we can see a difference between like the quote original marshes and the restored marshes in terms of how they function? You know, what's the East Coast eye view on how restoration is going and how practical it is?
Yeah, so there's a fair amount of restoration in the East Coast as well, and a lot of the things that Letitia was talking about are things that we're facing as well. There's been a fair amount of restoration of marshes that have happened in the coast of North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia. I've been involved in restoration of forested wetlands as well, and again, it's hard to do, but it's definitely not impossible to do. I think one of the challenges, and this is the same whether it's a marsh or a forested wetland or freshwater wetland, again, is what Letitia was talking about, is that we tend to think of restoration as a backward looking practice. Like we want to bring something back to what it used to be before, but the conditions have changed now. And, we can't bring it back to what it used to be before. And there's also the legacy of what we've done. So I love that, Letitia was talking about that they lost all these marshes in the estuary, and a lot of them were turned into agricultural fields. So I started working in this field because we started studying a restored wetland, a restored forested wetland that used to be in an agricultural field. And so we were looking at the greenhouse gas emissions from this restored wetland and the water quality benefits. And what we saw was that the restored wetland was a nitrogen sink, so it was good at cleaning water. Except during drought periods, we had saltwater intrusion, and it made this wetland go from a nitrogen sink to a nitrogen source. We saw release of nitrogen, and we think that we saw this extra nitrogen being released because there was legacies of fertilizer application to the soils. And so we're trying to, climate change is coming into landscapes that we've already changed. We're trying to restore them, bring them back, but the conditions are different and those systems are different. And the legacies of those changes that we've made are going to stick around for a long time. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. There's many benefits. There's different ways we can do it where we can address those negative consequences. We've also been working on restoring wetlands that we have here in North Carolina called Pocosin wetlands, which are also forested wetlands. They're peat wetlands. Their soil is very carbon rich. They have been drained, and what we're working on is just raising the water table. So it's relatively minor restoration in that all you're doing is putting water control structures. And by raising the water table, you decrease the greenhouse gas emissions, again, helping to mitigate climate change. So there's definitely lots of opportunities for restoration and lots of benefits that can come from them.
Just a quick reminder that I'm Christy Taylor, and this is Science Friday from WNYC Studios. We are getting near the end of our time, but we have a question from Rebecca in Colorado that I think both of you might have something to say about, and it's about dismantling man-made barriers. Rebecca, if you're able to ask that question, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, my question has disappeared from the chat page, so I can't remember exactly what it was, except it was about barriers, man-made barriers to wetland restoration. I was wondering, is there at least a conversation about dismantling some of these? Is it happening, or is it even being contemplated?
Letitia, maybe you want to go first on that?
Sure. That's a good question. I think there are areas that are being improved. So in a lot of cases where you've got a man-made barrier, it's eroding or falling apart, or it needs improvement. And usually what's behind it, people aren't ready to let it go yet. So certainly we've gotten rid of barriers when it's time to restore the wetland behind that and turn it into tidal marsh, then we might take down that levee entirely. And that's certainly happening. But where there's a Walmart parking lot behind it, and certainly if there's a neighborhood or a road or the footing to a bridge or a sewage treatment plant or Google, those are all things that are right behind the levees in San Francisco Bay. People aren't ready to have that be a more natural space. So what we can do though is replace that with what we call hybrid structures. Instead of all gray, they're green gray. And so they may have like it's maybe a levee with like a very shallow slope, and that slope can have a wetland on it. Sometimes we put treated wastewater to feed that wetland, and the water gets cleaned up, and we've got a wetland that's supporting wildlife and sequestering carbon. So there's these new ideas about how we can make these sort of hybrid measures around the shoreline. There is quite a lot of talk about managed retreat, which is people actually moving back away from sea level rise. And there is one instance of that happening in San Francisco where they're having really intense erosion around a piece of the water treatment system, and they're actually going to move everything back and let nature take its course and change the shoreline in that area. That's pretty rare. There's a little bit of that's happened in Louisiana, where there's some real extreme examples of wetland loss, and mostly people aren't ready yet to let go of land. On the other hand, I think thinking ahead is really important here. And the way I think of it is we retreat when we restore a wetland, so we know how to do that. maybe we can start retreating for parking lots and places that people aren't emotionally attached to. And then we could use that space for these really beneficial ecosystems that would really benefit everyone behind them. And then way down the road, we can think about the places that are really harder for us to deal with, because it is very painful to think about moving a neighborhood, for example.
So I'll just add a little bit to the, from the North Carolina perspective, is that there aren't many examples of removing those kinds of structures, but there are some. And I guess in the places where I've seen it happening is, again, former agricultural fields that are getting, saltwater intrusion, either be through surface water or through groundwater. So these fields are becoming less productive over time. It's becoming more expensive to actively pump them, so to keep them into agriculture. And so it gets expensive to keep them as ag fields. And so people are, well, in some instances, they're allowing wetlands to move back in. And the restoration of those areas usually will involve removing water control structures, maybe allowing for water movement to try to be a little bit more natural. So there are examples where this is happening. It could definitely happen at a much larger scale, and there's still a lot of opportunities about how to do it most efficiently and cost effectively.
Thank you both. We're gonna have to wrap up in just a few more questions, but here's one from an anonymous listener, actually, which is, how can we protect these marshes better from development? It seems like people don't know how important they are. In the book, Elizabeth Rush writes about Facebook building on a marsh and paying very little money, I think, for the privilege of doing so. And that's and that's very frustrating. This listener is saying in their anonymous comment. I was going to add on to that. Is it getting easier to convince people of the importance of these ecosystems? Is your work in any way getting easier to justify? How is it going? Is anything getting better? And I'll leave that to Marcelo. Maybe you want to jump on that first. You were nodding emphatically.
Sure. I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm generally an optimist, so I do think things are getting better. I do think that, it's not, there's a historical precedence for people not liking wetlands, right? And destroying wetlands. And it used to be that, if it wasn't productive, it was bad and it had to be cut down. And the government used to pay people to go and drain wetlands to put them into productive or agricultural practices. That's not the case now. Now there's protections for wetlands, and there's uncertainty there as well. There were changes to the laws that protected wetlands, but it looks like we're getting some of that protection back. So I do think that it's getting a little bit easier. It's getting a little bit easier for people to recognize the importance of these ecosystems. And I think people are excited about this idea of bringing back these ecosystems, and it won't be how they used to be, but maybe it can be something just as beautiful and just as functional.
Letitia, I know restoration is and government red tape is a huge part of your work. Is it getting better?
That's such a great question. It is, and the pressures are also getting bigger. And I guess what I'd say is, on the positive side, we have this incredible environmental ethic in coastal California and really strong support to do restoration. In fact, in the Bay Area, we taxed ourselves. It's the first time the entire Bay Area, all 9 counties, voted on the same thing in the same direction. We voted to tax ourselves to restore tidal marshes in the Bay, which is amazing. At the same time, we still have development pressure because it is so incredibly valuable to get that waterfront property developed. We still see development projects going in around the Bay, and people, what I mean is it like right at the edge of the Bay and what was historically a wetland, or maybe even is today a wetland, not as much of that because of some issues with environmental law. But what I will say is that people say, well, why should we do this? We need marshes there. And I certainly agree. I think for the greater good, we need marshes more than we need another development right on the edge of the Bay. But the real question I want to ask is, why are we putting people in the flood zone? We should not be building in the flood zone. And if we're going to do that, what happens is we put those buildings on a giant pad of material to get them up above some estimate of sea level rise. But that pad of material, that dirt, is really what we all need for sort of what I think of as a greater good kind of project, either building a levee that protects an entire shoreline or building a marsh that protects an entire shoreline. So I think what we're looking at is societal questions of trade-offs between the profits from an individual development and raising individual buildings versus the greater good of thinking communally about communities along the shoreline and how are they going to be protected. And I honestly don't think our regulation and governance is there yet. We still see a lot of pressure to develop right at the shoreline of the bay. And although most of it is protected, there's been enormous improvements over the past 30, 40 years. There's no doubt about that. It's just we're not 100% of the way there yet.
Last question, I think, for both of you, but if you had the ear of a policymaker who was able to, wave a legislative wand and fix something about the marshes you're working with, what would you tell them about your wetlands to get them on board? Like, is there a fact that you would throw at them? Is there an animal you would wave at them? I mean, like, not literally, maybe, like, if it's a wild animal, but something cute you would show them. What do you have in your pocket if you're ever in an elevator with the right person?
I think we need to regulate sediment. It's a precious commodity that we're giving away for free. It's not good. And we need to actually be able to regulate that migration space. So the place where the ocean and the wetlands want to go as sea level rises, that there's no government regulation of that space. And that's a huge problem because it can be developed. It's actually just as precious as the wetlands themselves at this point. So we do need some legislative change.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think I gotta fully agree. A lot of these wetlands in North Carolina are sediment starved. We don't have enough sediment, so that's why our marshes and our forested wetlands aren't keeping up. And we don't have good ways to either regulate or just even think about how these things are changing and how they're likely to change in the coming decades. And so we need better ways to think about it. I'm not that, I don't interact as much with policy, right? I do think there's like a philosophical change of how we think about these systems. It's hard when, the US legislative system has a lot about how to control land. It has less about how to control water. Wetlands are stuck in between. So we need to think more about how do we legislate these systems that are in between and that they're changing.
So we need a Save Our Sediment t-shirt and just a general tolerance for things that are not one thing nor the other, sounds like. Well, thank you both. That is all the time we have, and really appreciate you being with us today. Letitia Grenier co-directs the Resilient Landscapes program at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and Marcelo Ardon is associate professor at the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. Thank you both for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was great.